So welcome everyone. Thanks for your patience. It took a little while to get a convenient date here that was going to work for everybody, but we're all or mostly here, and I'm delighted to be talking about the topics in the third session here. So our agenda for today, kind of roughly speaking, is we'll just do a little bit of warm up, some orientation, and some, as I said, just a context setting here. We'll really focus time on the concepts that were embedded in the third module, both to talk about them and then to also get your input and thinking and discussion as well. So we hope to engage in a little bit of interactivity with you to talk about the concepts, see how they landed, and how they may be applicable to you and your organization. And then as part of that, we'll talk about some of the workshop activities and potential applications, because the whole point of this is really to be able to apply some of this stuff to your work now, or obviously in the future, should it become relevant at a future time and with your colleagues. And part of that is the baseline readiness assessment. And then we'll talk about some next steps, which may or may not be obvious at this point in time. So that's kind of the agenda. Gillian and I will be helping drive the agenda today. And with that, I wanted to just ask Teresa or Sean if you had any opening comments or thoughts as we move into this session.
Well, I just real quickly looking forward to going through this and hearing everyone's feedback. This was really where things start to come together to make sense of our mission going forward around creating the playbook. So I'm looking forward to that. And then following in the next week, we will start lining people up and focusing on our next 6 to 9 months, actually 6 months, that we're going to try to accomplish this in. So hopefully everyone's getting up to speed, speaking the same language, and we'll go forward from there. Teresa?
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I don't have much. I'm really excited. I saw an example of the opioid playbook today, and that fueled my excitement so much more. And I can't wait to see what product this work group creates. And so thank you all.
Fantastic. So with that, let's just spend a little time kind of warming up here. And Gillian, is this, am I giving you control here at all?
I don't have control yet, I don't believe, but I can speak to some of this.
Sure.
Oh, now I do. Look at me, I'm in control.
Always a good position.
Yes. So reflect back on the last module you just completed, and we'd love for you to put in the chat one thing that really resonated with you. And I'll give you all a minute to refresh your memory about everything that you learned in module 2, because I know it was action-packed.
This is the icebreaker, so
this is the warm-up for the warm-up. So I'll also share some things that were discussed in case it, trips up your memory. There was the baseline readiness assessment, all of the drivers. We looked at a family scenario. There was lots of needs for the different people in that family. So let's all share one thing that we took away from that.
All right.
Okay, we have the maturity matrix. Let's see a couple more. Maybe while people are putting their thinking hats on, Sean, do you want to share what you liked about the maturity matrix?
Yeah, I just thought it was a great starting point to do that self-assessment. Figure out kind of where you are, using that person-centered approach. What do we need to deliver on the journey, on their journey across the justice, health, and social domains, and then figuring out what those pieces are through that self-assessment, kind of finding out where our gaps are, set some goals and objectives around what we want and where we want to get. I think it really helps us then create action plans, set up some measurements, and really create a baseline to work from.
That's great. That sounds like a very tangible thing that came out of the training for you. And you have some people that agree, like Eric, or I'm sorry. Yeah, Eric agreed with you. And then Teresa, you commented on the case study. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, I liked how it walked us through the family and to see how all these different systems impacted that family, or where there were like certain system gaps. But what I liked even more was just that I forget what it's called because I did this so early, like I accidentally went through the whole thing. But it was like an infographic or a cartoon type thing showing you each stage of the process. And I think it really painted a visual picture of what this looks like and made it more real, like rather than just looking, okay, this is a system gap, but when you're looking at a specific family and how all these points intersect and affect that family, and it shows it like as a visual, I think that impacts a lot more.
That's excellent. Yes. So we can kind of see how this looks from a client perspective and where some of the needs are in addressing the family's needs. And Daniel's sharing that graphic. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that
Yeah.
was exactly what I was talking about.
Awesome. Okay, and then I think we wanted just to like get a quick understanding, do a quick poll of what's the extent to which you see this information applying to your efforts and your initiatives that are currently underway. So I know not all of you are on camera, so we can't really, I was going to ask you to give me, show me with your hands, but you can't do that. But how about put it in the chat from like a 0 means this does not apply. I don't see this working with our initiatives at present. That would be a 0 to a 10 is we can apply this right away. And anywhere in between 0 to 10, how does this apply to your work and strategic initiatives right now? Okay, we've got one vote. Let's see the votes keep coming in.
Refresh my the voting scale again. 1 is no.
Yeah, so
5
0
yes.
is 0 is this doesn't apply to my work. 10 is this is information we can apply right away. Okay, so we have kind of a range here. Who would like to share more about how it does or doesn't apply? Or let me rephrase that. What information could you apply to your work?
Well, in my case, I put the 10 because I'm speaking to just the work that I'm doing as my role on this stakeholder committee.
Mhm.
So it's, you know, it's the utmost important to be able to apply this framework to the work we're trying to put together.
Okay. And Andrea, you shared a 5. Can you say more about where you see it working and maybe where it doesn't apply?
Sure. I think part of the issue is having often being understaffed in different areas. And so I think it would take like a specific group of people to kind of work on the overall concept of the interoperability. And I can see people in individual departments trying to work on it as we go along in our daily jobs, but overall it might be kind of hard for the department.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's specific to resourcing.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. For those of you that see the application, can you share where you would like to apply it? I know Sean spoke a little bit about that. And Teresa, do you want to say a little bit more about where you see a place to apply it?
Yeah, so I just was actually typing in a whole paragraph. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, there's multiple places to apply it, but one of the things that we see as a significant issue as far as, like, for instance, statewide diversion programs, there's not a lot of consistency in definitions of things. And so it makes it really difficult when we come to the table to speak the same language, because everybody has different definitions, and having to understand what all of those things mean takes time. And it's a monumental task to build down those walls, because, for instance, like recidivism, there's like 100 different definitions of recidivism. But if I'm tracking recidivism differently than Maricopa County is, then when we like compare programs, it's like comparing apples to oranges. And same thing with like the day-to-day terminology that we utilize. For example, okay, so in community supervision alone, we have diversion, like on the sequential intercept model, is like the second to least restrictive as opposed to like policing deflection programs, right? And then you have probation and then parole. And we're all using risk assessment tools. We're all utilizing evidence-based practices, but our definitions of how we do things and some of the terms that we use is a little bit different. And if we're looking at like interoperability and that information exchange of, our risk assessment transferring to probation when they begin to supervise so that they can make informed decisions, if we don't have the same terminology, it makes it really difficult for them to understand how to apply and that information and to make those informed decisions. But the problem is that all of these definitions can significantly vary based on statute, internal policy, or even like how the grant funding that supports that particular program defines those terms. So like even just getting to where you speak the same language is very difficult.
That makes complete sense. And it sounds like just even having that outcome from this is something that's very valuable that would help you guys move forward.
I agree. As I think about it, like, if we could remove those barriers, it would be great.
Okay. Thanks for sharing, Daniel. I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think one of the lessons learned we've had over the years is, this kind of work really does take a concerted effort. It's not for the faint of heart, one might say. And as you're moving into strategic planning or specific project planning, there's a lot of applicability in those areas, because it does require sort of some very concrete sort of ways of learning some new approaches and applying those in specific situations. So when we get to action orientation, I think a lot of these concepts, while they're important and generally relevant, really come to play when you actually try to wrestle it down. And I'm hoping, and we'll have a little chance as we get into some of the other exercises here. We designed the course so that you could actually do that online, right? You should have seen the activity sections for, I don't know, 5 or 6 different questions that were embedded in here, maybe a few more. And we designed that so that individuals could actually kind of take the course, study it, input your own thoughts into it, and then use that as the basis for ongoing conversations with your teammates or your colleagues. So you actually had a way to actually compare and contrast and to discuss based on your own thinking and then your colleagues' thinking. And so I'm hoping that you got a sense of that. And I know that one of the things that I hope we get to do going forward is, in fact, to be able to leverage those tools there. So we'll come back to this. I think we want you to keep this in mind, especially as the playbook gets sort of more front and center, and/or as next steps become front and center, and in your work, how this can be applied, because it's all about application. It's all about how you do the work differently. And so with that, let me just move on a bit here. I've just got a few slides, just as a reminder, get everyone sort of focused in on this again. And of course, feel free to ask questions as we go forward on this. I mentioned this last time we spoke. I believe that kind of this graphic off to the left side here is an approach, as a sort of a generalized approach for coordinating various different kinds of programs, and that care coordinators are faced with, whether or not it's a health or behavioral health or housing or education question, not only systems, but also different groups of people and experts and folks who actually have to implement and integrate the programs. So if we keep our focus on the middle of this, figuring out not only what we need to do, but also what our colleagues need to do and what information exists in these systems, right? What do we know? Well, we know a lot about our own system, but what do we know about other systems, and how and what would be useful for them to be able to be able to do more of this coordinated, integrated work. And I think that, when we start talking about integration and interoperability, one of the main things that comes out here is it really is a different way of thinking about this work, and from a systems perspective. And as I've said many times in the past, that's not a natural behavior, right? Systems thinking is generally, if you're a systems thinker, that's the way you think about the world. If you're not, it's a bit of a foreign concept. And so working across the silos requires not only our own comfort with that knowledge, but also the uncertainty of not knowing a lot about these other programs, but the willingness to sort of put it into a context, an architecture of sorts. And so I really like this sort of person-centered approach. And of course, as you do your work and try to bring people into the conversation, feel free to use any of these things. I have experienced over time, people respond very differently to different kinds of stimuli, and sometimes these kind of pictures really help people understand what we're trying to accomplish, especially if they're not in the middle of these conversations. Any response, thoughts? I'm going to keep asking that question. Anything gets stimulated when you think about this, aside from some of the language that I know that a lot of concerns about some of the way we've talked about some of the different individuals involved here. Can you see yourselves in this? Let me ask that question. As you think about coordinating across the different disciplines and silos, is this a model that you can sort of bring out in sort of a group conversation and say, hey, we're here, this is our part of the pie, that's your part of the pie. What information are we sharing? What information could we share to address that individual in the middle? And a hearty yes, amen is good, as well as more detailed sort of thinking around it. Okay. Well, I take your silence as a confirmation of the value. I'll go with that. So let me move along here. We started this section on what we're calling user-centered design. Is that a? I wish people were, yeah. If you can use the emojis, or if you're on screen, just kind of give a hands up or put it into a chat. How many people have heard the term user-centered design before? Emojis are good as well. If you don't want to turn your camera on. Okay. A bunch of folks, and it's great. For those who have not, it's a whole area. It's a really fascinating way of thinking about sort of putting the customer in the center of this. And this really comes into play as we're thinking about the folks we're serving. And so we oftentimes draw on this particular sort of use case with our Garcia family, who've been with us for a long time, in order to simply to, again, illustrate an obvious statement, which is, people are receiving services from multiple different programs. Those things are not necessarily coordinated. They don't necessarily have the same standards. They don't have the same technologies. They don't have the same level of resources. But on the other hand, they're all delivering vital services to the individuals there, whether or not it's the mom, the daughter, the granddaughter, and that just proliferates the kind of services and kinds of coordination that's necessary. And I use this because it really reinforces in many ways just how complex the world is that we're dealing with, right? Here's 3 people in a little family that are touching all these systems, all these different services they're dealing with. And then you multiply this by millions, right? And we wonder why things get complicated. So the idea of user-centered design helps put people into the driver's seat. And as we talked about in the training, this comes out from my study. This comes out of really the technology world, and particularly the computer development world, as they were beginning to really develop applications and user interface stuff. Organizations have gone so far as to actually create these personas, actually either through Facebook profiles, or to actually create cardboard cutouts, or actually just to put these things in their offices to keep the voice of the customer, another way of calling it, front and center. So who is it that we're serving? Because I know we can get very abstracted in the day-to-day work we're doing. And so this one is obviously familiar to you. And one of the things this does, and I hope that you had a chance to sort of reflect on this workbook activity. As you think about this person, what kind of sense do you have about them, right? Can you use this kind of design to say, what do we understand about their life situation? What's here? What's needed? What's missing, right? Because it makes it sort of personifies them. So for those of you who actually sort of work through this, what's your sense of it when you look at this? What more would you want to know about this person?
Daniel, Sean, when I was working through this, it reminded me of a scenario, actually a situation where we were at a behavioral health conference, and Shanda Breed and I think Kathy Waters led a exercise that is kind of along the same line.
Yeah.
And we did role playing. So it was a live role playing exercise where several of the people, we just drew from a hat, see what a role was. Some people were, if you go back one slide, some people were the individual that was re-entering from incarceration or on diversion. And then other people may have been the Medicaid manager, the childhood psychologist, driver's licenses. And we had to go through all these, these needs down below. So I need to get a driver's license. I need to get insurance. I need to get a job. I need to find food. And so I saw some real parallel between that kind of exercise and this user-centered design. It really helps highlight that. I'm
Right.
thinking we're gonna do that in one of our future sessions, is run one of those scenario situations again, let everybody participate.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sean. And that's exactly the implication. This particular graphic that we did, this was actually for the state of Connecticut, as they were looking at redesigning the way they were organized around variety of the programs, which they were trying to put into sort of a coordinated care management program. What I like about this was, and we were trying to do just that. So as we think about, justice involved or diversion programs, one of the things that we could do is actually create a scenario that is specific to, Arizona, specific to the kinds of challenges that are being faced, that you're facing. And here, what was incredibly valuable was the two boxes on the right side. So we can sort of describe the family or the individual that's sort of prototypical kind of individual from a diversion program, who they're involved with, what kind of services they're receiving, their housing situation, their educational situation, employment, all those things can be referenced visually so we know who we're talking about as at least one example. But the part on the right side, which is what do we need to know from the client, our customer or person, or what do we need to know from the system, it had been a very powerful way to think carefully about what data we've got, right? So oftentimes our systems give us more administrative data. They may give us case management information. There may be more sort of tangible structured data, but they don't necessarily tell us much about who that client is. Do they have community connections? Are they part of a faith-based organization? Are they part of a gang? Are they living alone? Are they living in an extended multi-generational family? And by beginning to think about it sort of in these buckets can be helpful for filling out that individual, right? Who it is that we're serving. And as a result of that, we can think a little bit more about how are our systems designed to accomplish that. And that's really the purpose of this question here. So Sean, you shared with us some thoughts there. I'd love to hear from other folks around, whether or not, just kind of off the cuff, as one might say, how you would introduce this idea of a persona in your work, and where do you think who might be interested in this, and how it would land, so to speak, in your organization. Volunteers are welcome. I reserve the right to call on people as well. So
Carrie Hyatt would probably have a good description.
Yeah, excellent. Carrie, you've been nominated. Maybe not. Who else would like to offer up a thought?
So this is Teresa Fuller. I'm just going to throw out there, I think, specifically you're talking about how we could utilize these personas in our work
Yes.
that we're doing day to day, correct?
Yep.
So for me, like when I saw these, I thought, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to utilize them. One is, to educate the community about how we work and how we can all work together. But more importantly, like for our staff, from a training perspective, I think it's something that's more engaging in helping them identify those system gaps and how we all play a role in affecting the individuals that we work with by just even having a lack of communication or sharing resources.
Yeah, I think part of the exercise here is actually defining that. And to Eric's point, the Benson family were a pretty clear-cut social services, healthcare, SNAP kind of child support case. It's, you know, it's a family and they're interacting with those systems. Here, which is actually an interesting kind of conversation, is, as you said here, Eric, you know, there are multiple intersecting spheres, you know, who's, and how do you reflect that? Well, I'm confident that we can reflect that graphically, depending on how you'd want to show that. Are there examples of that? Is there a picture you've seen of this sort of multi-engaged sort of environment with perpetrators, people who are the victims, public? How is that displayed these days, if at all, aside from just a narrative? My sense is that, you know, again, people are thinking in silos around these things. So you're either a victim of the crime, or you perpetrated the crime, or you're sort of experiencing it in your community. But do we have a complete view of that sort of ecosystem? Or is the field treated as individual sort of components?
Yeah, Daniel, this is Eric. And what I was thinking of is, you know, I think one of the major elements of this section, this module of the training, was a systems view. If we only focus on, for example, the Garcia family, we can certainly draw a very interesting picture of how they interact with multiple systems. But if we think about this from a higher level, and we look at victims, and we look at community-based organizations, and we look at all of the systems that are engaged here, I wonder if that reveals more information and identifies more opportunities for us to create interoperability.
Undoubtedly, and I like that you're sort of referenced the system of systems thinking, because each of those systems has a contributing factor in it. And that's why that pinwheel diagram is maybe a way to think about the complex. You know, you can almost think about the different personas in those different areas, maybe different labels there, but thinking about the complexity of how they intersect and interact with potentially the victim, or whoever ends up in the middle of that, the person who we're trying to, you know, the diversion program is designed for, perhaps. That's what I'm getting at. That idea of being able to bring a systems thinking perspective to the table is, you know, it's something that needs to be thought about and needs to be created, right? You need people from the various perspectives to come together to be able to sort of define that and to articulate and to illustrate what that looks like. Otherwise, it's, you know, it just doesn't fall out of the sky, right? It takes some work to really think about the complexities of that. So perhaps, you know, as we move forward in this, Sean, that's one of the exercises, is to really sort of create that that map of who it is, what systems are being touched, to what degree, and so we actually have a view of it, and everybody can get to that definitional point, like, well, here's what we call that. Are we all on the same page? Because part of this is getting people on the same page in order to be able to have the conversation on what needs to change. Okay, so with that in mind, let me move forward here. Trying to move forward here. We talked about the Bensons a little bit. The other family, if you want to talk about complex systems, and I think I've shown this in the past, is some work we've done now. This reflects actually a family that's being served by a federal program called the Integrated Care for Kids. And it is their goal to address families who are at risk of having children removed as a result of drugs and alcohol in the house. And it's a Center for Medicaid Medicare Innovation program and recognizes the intersection between Medicaid and education, justice, child welfare, behavioral health. And this is a high-level view of a family that's kind of a pretty deep-end family, but it does reflect the severity of the issues that are being faced. Again, it's just another visual of thinking about whether or not it's mom, who's Sarah, who's the mom, or Jameson, who's the son, or the grandmother, or the dad, who's a vet who's sort of ostracized from the family. Each of these are their own world with their own set of services, kind of like the Garcias, but with a little more complexity and the social determinants along the bottom. Again, it helps us be able to both focus in on a macro perspective, and then also be able to draw out the individuals and see what is affecting them. I imagine in this scenario, Jameson might be the focus of our attention, given he's a young man who's probably bumping into a lot of things that are going to unfortunately drive him in a direction towards needing a diversion program. So let me spend a little time here on the change drivers. Again, with a show of hands or thumbs or chat, when you sort of went through this particular piece, did it resonate with you? One thumb up, two thumbs up. Was it making sense to you? Okay, great. Thanks, Gary. Part of the reason I asked that is this work has really evolved over the years when we were working with leaders and studying a number of the different jurisdictions, counties, and states that were trying to do this cross-system data sharing. And what we found was that each of these drivers were part of a dashboard, really, either a mental dashboard or literally sort of written down on a regular basis, where the leaders were really taking a measure of their organizations, of themselves and their organizations, and how well they were able to do this work. And each of them are really a category of knowledge and information. When combined, actually provide a pretty robust set of measures to do this work, whether or not you're focused on adult protection or child welfare or healthcare or stamps or justice or whatever it might be. And what was interesting was that these themes and these areas continued to really surface over many years that we were looking at this. And it really provides the basis for the baseline assessment. Because what we found was, if one is you were aware of all these things, secondly, if you knew how well your organization was doing, that allowed you to sort of focus attention and resources in those places that needed further development. And so it was a tool for more efficiently really focusing in on what are the kinds of changes that needed to happen. And again, I asked that, I sort of asked that sort of rhetorical question of where do you gravitate towards, right? Are you more on the information technology side or the performance management side? And how do you expand your peripheral vision to be able to pay attention to all of these things and to be able to know the degree to which you have both knowledge and skills and capacities to advance this work? So each of these things, and I hope that you saw this in at least the customer service one, we spent some time creating these rubrics for each of those drivers, because in many ways, the drivers are the heart of this whole process, right? We think about system of systems thinking, each of those systems are operating, but they're operating within an environment or an ecosystem that depends on all of those drivers to be effective. And yet we need a common language in order to assess our capabilities. So this one is particularly focused around, this one in particular is focused around a customer service or customer focus here. And what we've done is we've articulated sort of the competency level up from sort of what we're calling weakness all the way up to mastery. So that, again, an organization could agree on a scoring, because everybody has a different opinion of what this looks like. And we felt it was relevant and critical actually to actually writing this down, so that in that process of doing an assessment, that we would in fact be working from the same set of definitions. These definitions can be tweaked over time. Particularly in some fields, we've rewritten them to reflect the specific language of a discipline or concepts that are relevant, that may be more applicable in one area than another. And so as you think about this, as you think about your own organization, your own work, it begins to set out, as I said, this rubric for you to think about, well, how well are we doing against these drivers? And what data do I have? How am I assessing myself or my organization about where I need to spend time? And of course, that leads us to the maturity matrix. Of all the work we've done over the years, this tool is probably one of the more useful tools that people have commented on in terms of applicability in their work, right? So it helps us think, or helps you think, and all of us think about a particular driver, and whether you may have drivers other than those 10 that are particularly relevant to your area. But the basic concept is really coming to an agreement around the level of importance of that driver to accomplishing your goals or your mission, right? And then what is your level of mastery on that, from weakness to mastery? And then that helps you actually put that driver in the quadrant that is most representative of the consensus opinion. Having that map of where the world looks, what it looks like, then helps the organization say, okay, we're in agreement around, these are our strengths, these are the areas of we're good enough, but here's the places we need to really invest and build our capabilities. And I have to say, you can do this very quickly. You can do it sort of off the cuff. You can have a much more sort of thoughtful process around it using the rubrics. And there's also a quantitative survey attached to this as well that has about 175 questions that actually gives you a score on each of the 10 drivers. And we've done that with a number of jurisdictions, including the federal government, to actually get a numerical baseline from which we're actually going to measure, because systems, may spend millions or tens of millions or more putting into place significant change efforts, and yet not having a baseline to measure against is probably the most egregious error that organizations don't do, because you get at the end of that process or along the way, and what is it that you're measuring against? It's kind of quicksand. So by putting in place a baseline like this, gaining agreement, saying this is where we think our strengths and our weaknesses are, these are our investment areas, it at least helps the organization have a common view of where they're headed. Why are we paying attention to this or that versus X or Y? So I look for, we're going to talk about the customer service piece in just a second here, but wanted to open up the floor and just hear your thoughts about this tool in particular, how you think about it from your organization, and whether or not you've done anything like this, and or how you would think about it impacting your work. I think it sounds like coffee and donuts time. All right, so let's do it. Let's do an exercise here then for a second. So in terms of thinking about the customer that you serve, right? Hopefully you've had a chance to go through the module. You've had a look-see at that. Let's think about serving our customers. whoever your customer is, and who would you say your customer is? Actually, Eric, I think you said there may be multiple customers, but who would be one customer within the diversion program that would be paramount? Is it the individual themselves? Is it the guardian? Is it the courts? Who's our customer in this situation?
Daniel, I think it depends on. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm interested in hearing what you're thinking.
Well, I'm thinking it depends on a lot of different circumstances, because in most situations, yeah, it's going to be the defendant, but if we have a victim too, part of our job is to keep them safe and to help make sure, like, if there's restitution, that they get restitution, that services are in place to, reduce probability or reduce likelihood that the defendant's going to reoffend, that kind of stuff. So I think it really just kind of depends, because each circumstance is individualized based on the circumstances involving the case.
Other thoughts on that? I would suggest that that's not too different than industry, right? Who's your customer is the question. That was resonant for many years in industry. Who are you? Is it the person who's buying the product? Is it the person who is building it? If you're an internal engineer in an organization, because your customer may not be the person who's actually purchasing the product and the service, but it might be the person for whom you are delivering a service, right? So that they can actually design or build or implement or sell or market that. So the idea of having multiple customers is really an important consideration. Yeah, because you're right, it does change. Who are you focused on? Is it the person who's been harmed, or is it the person who is the defendant in this case? Let's go ahead.
Can I just jump in? This is Carrie Hyatt. I guess the thought that I'm having to kind of jump onto what Teresa's saying is the people a lot of times who are justice involved and they're coming out of prison for my situation, there's so many needs that they become your primary customer. And I guess you have to kind of think of it in levels. It's all about degrees, right? And because there's so much that they need right away, I think that we think of them as our primary customer, but certainly the public or, public safety, it's our responsibility to make sure that people who are going to put public safety in jeopardy are not able to do that. So, and that can be a victim. It can be, we try to help people get reconnected with their family. So that's certainly a customer. We try to work really well with other agencies. So they're our customers too. But so it's about, levels from a primary customer to get people kind of what they need. And all of those, the 10 things we were looking at there, those are all so important. They really all of them resonated with me. It just triggered so many thoughts. So that's all. Thanks, Daniel.
That's great. So that's part of the process here, is to define those things, right? Like so does even everybody have the same definition of who you're serving, right? Because Carrie, I just heard you say, well, it probably is a person coming out of prison or jail. And yet, in fact, other people may be thinking as our customers are is the public, or it's the, somebody else in that process. So it's just another example of really being clear about definitions and understanding that, because if we're trying to improve a process or a service, we're going to need to know who it is that we're trying to serve there. So in this situation, let's say we were talking about the person who's coming out of prison. As a customer service, how would you rate that? One being the sort of not not that important, least important, 4 obviously being the most important. Is this more of a 4 or 1 or 2 or 3 in terms of your focus? And again, just you can put a number in a chat, or you can hold your hands up or whatever. Carrie, I think I heard you say this is probably the most important thing. So would you say that's a 4 for you?
Yes, I would, just because of the extent of the needs that are there, and all the stuff that has to happen. That's very important. That's a 4.
So if we assume that we're talking about that same person that Carrie is sort of visualizing in her mind, would anybody score it differently? Is there a more important customer, or is there a more important individual than this one? Would you all give it a 4 as well, or would anybody come and say, well, no, it's really more of a 3, 2 maybe. It's important, but there's other stuff to get done here.
Okay, I'm gonna take a sword on this one, I'm pretty sure, but
Okay.
so let me preface it by saying that. But like from a diversion perspective, we have a different role, right? And most of our defendants have never spent a day in jail or have never been incarcerated.
Okay.
And so from a preventative standpoint, right, like I agree that on the inmates who are re-entry, you know, they have a lot more barriers sometimes, people think, but our diversion defendants have significant barriers that they face too. So for us, that would be like the higher priority because that's the population we're working with. And from a preventative standpoint, to keep them from further penetrating the system, that's where we would want to put our resources. But I understand Carrie's point of view too, because she has a different role and her population is very high risk and has high needs.
Mm-hmm.
So just a different thought or perspective, I guess. Playing devil's advocate.
No, I think that's a great example, you know, of, again, a differing perspective on who are we talking about? But I guess I would ask the question in every case, whether or not whoever it is that is the key customer, so to speak, are they always a 4 in your work? Is that is it always important to focus on them, their situation, their needs, or other things?
I would say not necessarily so, because take, for example, like a probation defendant who absconds, right, and is a high risk to society. The focus is not necessarily on them at that point. It's on, you know, protecting the community. Whereas maybe before that particular case, right, or that particular scenario, the focus was on that defendant to help enhance or, you know, encourage positive behavioral change and meet needs. But like, for instance, we just had a case where a defendant was sentenced to probation and within 10 hours absconded and was threatening to kill the victim. And so at that point, like, our focus was no longer on meeting the needs of that individual defendant. It was on keeping that victim safe.
Yeah, that's a great example of it. Eric, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm wondering if when we look at a baseline assessment, if there really are at least 2 dimensions to consider. One is, what is the actual process? Okay, is this a probation process? Is this a diversion process? Is this a reentry process? And then a second element of that is, where are we on the time scale? Okay, are we, you know, the earlier or the later we are in the process may determine who the primary customer is, just as was just identified. If the process is probation and early in the process, it is trying to figure out what's the best path for that individual, then maybe the defendant becomes the primary customer. But once a determination is made and now we are at the point where they've been released, maybe at that point it becomes the public. So I think the definition of who the customer is will change as a result of what the specific process is and where that process is on a timeline. Does that make sense?
It makes all the sense in the world to me. I'm wanting to hear from Emma and Andrea as well, and Cindy about that, because I think it's really spot on.
I agree.
So
I agree with that too. Sometimes the state is our primary goal after primary entity that we need to satisfy after we've had an outbreak, because we have to fill out the state's form in our medical information system, and it has to be right for them. So it depends on where we are. If we're at the beginning of the outbreak, it's the sick students and also protecting the health of everyone around them. But towards the end, it becomes more of the state, which might sound odd, but that's the way it is with an outbreak. So I think it's totally dependent on the timeline, like Eric is saying.
thank you, Andrea. One of the things that this, again, it reinforces to me to state the obvious is, that this changes, right? So customer changes depending on where you are in the process, and defining that clearly is, again, so important for getting this right, or at least putting in place plans to really understand where along that process, and who are we focused on, and what are our services, and who are they being focused towards, and are they in the right balance? Are they agile enough to be able to switch from one to another seamlessly? And that's, in many ways, that's part of the rubric here, is being able to define those things, again, for your industry. I think one of the things I'm hearing in this part of the conversation is, customer depends on kind of where you sit and where and at what point in the case is evolving, and that actually might shift to a different person. So you're right. I think if this exercise were to be implemented, within this organization or within this work group, we would want to define that. Maybe we'd have 3 or 4 or 5 customers, right? Who are the customers? When you're, again, thinking about user-centered design, who are the customers here? And the Garcias, all 3 of them are customers, right? Some of them had more dependencies than others. In this situation, there are multiple customers as well, potentially. And then what's our competency? Think again, if you just selected out one of the customers, put it in that grid. I go back here for a second and I said, okay, so, the defendant, we're going to want to make sure that, this is super important, but what's our maturity around that, right? How well are we doing around each of those things? So we actually come to a consensus around that, using the rubric, if and how it's applicable, using more quantitative methods. Professional judgment is oftentimes very valuable. Oftentimes it's on the alignment, sometimes it's not. But even the conversation to say, okay, we're talking about the defendant, and we're talking about the upfront part of the process. How ready are we as an organization to understand or to provide the kinds of surveillance or services or coordination that person is going to need? can you have that conversation? Do you have that conversation today with that kind of explicit focus? And that's not a rhetorical question. That's actually, how do you think about those kinds of challenges? Any examples are welcome. Emma or Cindy, any thoughts on how we define our ability to address those particular challenges? Okay. Anyway, I'm sort of harping on this because I want to make sure that you have a good sense of how to use the tool. Because as I said, over the last 10 years or so, it's been one of the most powerful tools that I've seen, again, at the state, federal, local, CBO level. So I offer that up there. And that really becomes part of the as is or current state of your organization. You define what is the state of your current situation? What are your competencies, right? Which are the most important drivers that you have identified? What's your competency? And that defines your as is state. I can't remember earlier who said that. Kind of describes a project plan. Well, in the same way this does as well, because you always want to know where you're starting from. And there's usually multiple different starting places in an organization. Defining the as is critical. And this, I think, goes a long way for defining that, gaining consensus around it, so that whatever actions, recommendations, strategies, plans, and investments that are made are based on where we believe, to the best of our ability, where we're starting from. So those are really, from my perspective, the major components of this third module, right? Is that sense of the consumer, that user. Who are they? What do we know about them? What do our systems tell us about them? What can we learn about them from other areas? What are the drivers of change or competency in an organization is defined by those change drivers, the rubrics associated with that, and then of course the ability to actually apply those into a matrix in order to be able to identify what needs to happen, and from that, what are the strategic actions that can be taken to address either those development areas or the shortcomings. I want to open the floor, ask for questions that folks might have. Again, anything that resonated well with you, or anything that was missing from there, or anything that just didn't work for you. And we can go around. That would be super. We don't need to belabor the training today if it's all kind of going in and you're all getting it. So the floor is open. Comments from folks would be welcome at this point. Sean, let me put you on the spot here as we're thinking about this playbook. I think that there's even in the opioid playbook, we use the same processes to identify that in pieces of this, to look across the various different domains as we were looking at how different areas were thinking about or could be worked, how different areas could work together to address this, particularly the opioid issue at the time. Do you see this kind of process, this kind of sort of methodology as we're going forward being applicable within the vision that you've gotten, you've been discussing around sort of playbook around diversion stuff? I don't know if people have got their the microphone's locked or what. Gillian, you can hear me, right?
I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sorry, I had to grab a call. I'm back.
Yep. Okay. I had just put you on the spot to say, as we're thinking about the playbook, how do you envision, the degree of work that goes into sort of articulating a common vision is not insignificant. Competencies. Do you see this approach being useful as we go forward? And if so, how, are there specific ways to get people on the same page together?
Is that, you directing that to
Yeah.
me, Sean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to look at my notes, but I actually identified within the last module. Oh, okay. Actually, really just kind of as a launching point to start discussing plays within a playbook would be really just start out with a discussion of the organizational change drivers.
Right.
They're all points that need to be addressed around strategically establishing interoperability. So that's something that's where I thought we would probably start. Obviously, all the practitioners that are involved really need to drive this. So I'm just trying to facilitate it.
Daniel, can I throw out just a thought?
Of course, sir.
I mean, obviously I'm not directly involved in this project, but I have had the opportunity of listening to several of the meetings now. And I'm wondering, as the group thinks about what its next steps are, working through these processes, I'm wondering, what are the next steps? For example, would you start out by saying, here are the 5 major processes that we want to look at in terms of interoperability? That could be diversion programs, it could be reentry programs, whatever it is that you think are the priority projects and or programs where you could work together to move the needle. Once you've identified those, would it make sense then to look at this process as was defined in this module and look at the maturity matrix and see where do we stand? Let's pick one of the processes as saying this is the one we're going to start with, and go through that and say here's where we are in terms of the maturity matrix to identify where the potential gaps and one of the other ways to look at a gap is the gaps are actually the opportunities to move the needle. So where are our best opportunities, and then develop project planning around those. That way you're essentially starting out at a systems of systems level, looking at how all the processes interact, selecting the processes or process that you want to start with, and then really narrowing down on that. I don't know if that makes sense. And again, I'm an interloper here, so I'm just suggesting, is that a viable path forward, or is there something else that you see that makes more sense?
Are you asking Daniel specifically, or is that an open question?
I was asking that as an open question, and Cindy, I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea from a project management standpoint, especially. It rather than overwhelming people with, multiple, items at one time, you're kind of breaking it down to focus on one to start. It gives you an opportunity to move through the process and learn from it as well. And so that as you add more later on down the road, once you succeed with this and you add more down the road, then you've got the lessons learned that you can also incorporate it to make it even better next time.
Yeah, and I would just say, from my days, my previous days in consulting, we used to call this the nibbling approach. Instead of trying to eat the entire pie at once, we would nibble at a bite. And it's amazing how much success you can build, because once you're successful with one of these processes, then it kind of, it steamrolls.
Right.
And you say,
Yeah.
oh, well, we were able to do it here, we can do it here. And the second one we pick may be something that's connected too. So not only do you work on that one, but you also work on the connecting pieces to what you just did. So you just keep building on what you have and continuing to develop the relationships between all of the players.
Right. Yeah, I 100% agree with that.
Yep, I agree as well. I think we identify the personas in that process and go forward. But just on one at a time.
That's great. The process and approach can be sort of focused in on that once you define that particular program or process, and it does make it more less scary. Let me put it that way, because we're not talking about an entire strategic effort here. We're talking about optimizing a particular program or particular process that's going along. And then we can look at the actual components that are affecting that. And some may have greater impact, and some may not have greater impact. And assessing the need, the importance of those, and the organizational capacity for change gives us a starting point, which I think is probably particularly useful in this situation. So I would agree, Eric. Thank you for that recommendation. I think that's probably a good first step in terms of getting people to agree on what that process or program is, and then to begin to apply the tools in that regard. So that would actually start with our second point up here, which is to apply the strategies and tactical plans to actual planning for diversion. Sean, to move that forward, I don't know what the process is at all in terms of gaining consensus or just continuing the process or developing a sort of a planning work team around that. I don't know if you have any developed thoughts around that yet.
Yeah, well, Teresa and I was talking earlier today. We've got to convene in the next week or two and come up with our agenda for the remaining portion of this. And I think that the approach that Eric surfaced here, I think is the right approach. And we'd like to have Eric involved in it.
He's a generous
And
fellow.
Cindy.
And if you can get him to participate, he's an amazing contributor, as you've seen already today, which is why I try to drag him into everything we do.
Well, that is very kind of both of you. And Sean, if there is anything that I can do to help, I'm happy to try to help.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So
And we seem to be a little bit light on some of the practitioners today too.
yep. Well, one of the things maybe we could do is, we are recording this, so maybe there's a letter that goes out from you and Teresa and asking people to sort of if there's another session before that next session, is to sort of listen through this hour, get everybody at least aligned around this, and then we could at least be on the same plane at that point. It would be hard to have another conversation with people who are not attending today. So I think they're going to need to attend to that.
Daniel, looking at your recommended next steps, you have you now have the privacy and consent course available.
Yes, there's a 2-module course that the first module is up and available. So that is now fairly recently we put that up, and I think that's a critical part of creating knowledge and some familiarity knowledge with obviously privacy and consent, which are many areas sort of primary in terms of being able to do any kind of data sharing. So if there's interest in that, we can figure out how to make that available or expand the agreement so that people can take that course. And it's just started. People are just starting to take it up now.
Yeah. We've been talking with more behavioral health participants in Pinal County, and they're very interested. So I think that's going to be key once they start getting more involved. Because that's one of the first questions they ask. Well, what do you want to share?
Exactly. For what purpose? The last bullet point there is on the consent service utility, which I've mentioned in the past, which is actually trying to develop a mechanism for obtaining consent. It's a much broader effort, and we've spoken about it in the past. There is interest in a couple of states, New York and Colorado and California, and we've sort of floated the topic here as well. But that may be may not be center of the plate here for this group, but certainly in terms of being able to obtain consent for enabling data sharing, it's a critical part of the work, and I'm happy to share more details with that. In fact, we're been doing and we'll be doing some more national webinars around that over the next couple of months. So there'll be more information around that.
Daniel, I have a question on the consent service utility.
Yep.
Is that built off of some work that was going on a few years ago at the federal level at SAMHSA? And then second question is, can it be integrated into an existing information exchange?
So yeah, it actually, the consent to share that came out of SAMHSA is that is part of it. That's one of the practices, and that's mostly focused on behavioral health consent and privacy. That has been adopted by organizations and is being sort of further refined, but it is only a part of the equation. So we did a national scan of promising practices around consent last year, and certainly that was one of them, and folks from SAMHSA were involved in it, and other organizations that are using it. But we're also looking at healthcare and HIPAA consents, as well as educational and FERPA-related consents, and ones that might be applicable in other areas, domestic violence or housing or SNAP or WIC or other areas as well. The idea is that this would be, in a sense, be its own registry, and there'd be one place within a community that the consents or the location of the consents would be stored, and that would consolidate the ability to share information amongst multiple different partners. Part of the problem today, is you're probably familiar with, is that there's a lot of consents out there, but there's no centralized repository of them. So it's really hard to know whether or not there's a consent for a particular individual, especially if they're receiving multiple services. And so it's quite a journey to find them, see if they're actually still current, applicable, and compliance with law. The utility is, the idea is to actually have one place where an authorized individual or organization could query to say, even to be able to query the registry, essentially to say, is there an active consent for Eric? And do I have is there authorization for been provided to share his X, Y, or Z information, and with what organization? And that is potentially, again, that really emerged and grew out of the work we did the last couple of years. First met Eric was on this national action agenda. One of the things we really challenged the group with over a year we were meeting was, what could we do that would be really tangible and useful and important and replicable and structural change kind of things. And this really emerged from that, the idea of having a consent utility, because every community struggles with this and suffers through trying to figure this out and pays too much money to attorneys and others, right? So this really emerged in a big way as something that is actually everybody needs, and there's no current solution for that. Consent to share is one piece of the puzzle there. There's work that's happening in different parts of the country out of the EHRs or the regional health information exchanges or the HIEs that are trying to do that, or have done it within a hospital setting or a particular organization have been able to capture that, maybe electronically, maybe on paper still, and that to actually be able to manage this and to be able to replicate it in an open source model, in an open source way, is the vision for this. And it has resonated and continues to resonate with literally everybody we speak to about it, up through the national coordinating, national Office of National Coordinator, who is just asked us to participate in a national workshop on this in August, to different presentations we made over the last couple of months. So we can, if there's interest and there's applicability, we certainly can go into greater detail on this. And people who are interested in this particular topic are welcome to join us in our National Interoperability Collaborative, which is the first bullet point at the top of the next steps. For this kind of work to, sort of to take off, it requires sort of persistence and consistency, of course. It's episodically, it's hard to get enough momentum. So the NIC is a group that is continuing to meet. We meet virtually every week. There's about 30 people, 25 to 30 people who literally have been meeting for the last 3 years, although that group changes and new people are coming into it all the time. And that really came out of a lot of the work we've done building a national collaborative. It's a resource, it's a technical resource, it's a legal resource, it's just a lot of different people and organizations that have been coming together to do this work. That is open to folks who want to join it. And we're really focused on this consent use service utility now, looking to stand up some pilot sites in the Bronx and in Colorado and in California, and potentially even in parts of Arizona with people who've expressed interest. So that's available to folks. We welcome you into it. It's a stimulating, exciting, usually exciting, if not interesting conversation. But also just there's a lot of material on that site that takes a little bit of navigating, but all of these sessions are recorded. So we probably have, I don't know, 50, 60 different sessions on different topical areas that's available to folks. And then there's this online community. Several of you have signed up for it. If we go forward, that would be a place to sort of do the work together. And so asynchronously, we can be working on documents, posting stuff that's important, having conversations, and engaging in conversation. This is the hub itself. So for those who've been on, it's available. It can become very active, and over the number of years we've worked with this, it is very engaging, especially if around a topic or a project. So it's a great sort of project management communication tool for folks. And so that's available. And we certainly wanted to build up on that. There's a link here, and we'll send out to some of the different resources I've mentioned here. All this stuff should be available. So with that, I think we have other content. I don't think we have other content we're presenting. So if there's other questions or commentary, now would be a great time to raise those. If not, we can let you guys sort of reconvene and figure out the next steps and timing on things. So Sean, Teresa, if you have thoughts around that, more than welcome to hear them.
Yep, no, I agree. This is what we plan on doing is getting everyone through this curriculum, and then doing a little bit of an assessment to see who wants to stay on, who wants to keep going forward, and plotting that strategy. So I'll be reaching out with Teresa to get all that aligned in the next week or so, and then we'll see if, what the next steps from our side of it are, and hopefully we'll continue to engage with you and the SOC team to keep in the loop on what we're trying to accomplish. That's from my perspective anyway.
Great, thanks, Sean. Okay,
Teresa?
Any other thoughts, Teresa? Anyone else? Okay, so we'll send it. You know what we'll do, Sean, is I'll ask Gillian to send out this once we get the link back from Zoom and the PowerPoint slides. We'll send them out to everybody. And we'll make a recommendation that before our next meeting, and maybe what we can do is we can coordinate. So maybe after you and Teresa talk, we can sort of figure out if there's a next meeting, what the topic will be. But can send the materials out to say, okay, in preparation for the next meeting, please take a look at this hour video.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds a great plan.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for participating. I know there's a lot of material to go through. You should have your certificate or have access to your certificate. Use it proudly. There's digital stickers you can put under your signature. Sean, I know that you're leading the way on that, so we appreciate that. And any other questions that come up, you know where to find us. And we'll be getting back in touch with you before the summer arrives.
And
Yeah,
give
pretty sure I
yourselves
posted my certificate. Oh, sorry.
give yourselves a hand. You did it.
Yeah, I put mine on LinkedIn.
Yeah, actually, that's a great thing.